Welcome to the user preferences video in the DaVinci Resolve user reference manual step-by-step series. Now this is going to start kind of abruptly because actually this was part of the last video when I first edited it, but it was just too long, so I had to cut it in half. So when we jump in, it's going to just be right there going. So we are covering the user preferences in the preference panel. I hope you enjoy it. So let's move on to the user side of things. We start with UI settings, but first let's look at the three dots up here on the right because they definitely change now that we're in user settings. Now, first of all, you can save the user preferences as a preset, which is what I did, and that's why it shows right here that I am under the SCA preset. Those are my initials. And so I have previously saved my preference settings the way that I wanted them, so that if I decide to go back and let's say I want to click a bunch of things and see what they do and play around with it, and I want to go over in here and click all this and change things, and I don't really know if it's doing anything, or I do know that it is and I don't like the effect that it's having, I could always just go back up here and go back to load preset, and everything went back to the way that it was set when I saved that. So you can save your user preferences as a preset, and then once you're in that preference, or that preset, you can go in there and I can export it. I can either delete it, update it. You can update it by, let's say I want to make a bunch of changes, and I think, oh yeah, that worked out. I want to add this to my preset. So just go up here, go up under your preset and say update. Now I'm not going to do that. I'm actually going to go under load so that it loads it back to the way it was. But that's how you'd update it. You can also export the preset, or you can reset user preferences. Pretty self-explanatory. So let's go to UI settings. Let's see, this is under English. You can also set it to auto, and I'm sure it will go to whatever your computer language is set to. Reload last working project when logging in. Now I actually keep this off, and I'm going to go ahead and update my preset with that, because I don't want that actually taking effect when I work on this system, which is the one I shoot my videos with. I like it to go ahead and open to the project manager every time so that the people watching see the same thing. Now on my editing system that I edit all my videos on, I do have that checked, because pretty much I work on one project until it's done. So I wanted to just keep opening that one without making me have to choose which project I want. And that works out good for me. I think most people prefer to have that checked. Show focus indicators in the user interface. Let's click down to see what that means. Lets you enable or disable the line at the top of each panel that indicates which panel has focus. Now I don't know why this is unchecked, but I like to be able to see which panel has the focus, and we'll talk about that when we get into the edit page and cut page and all that. But if this is not checked, I would definitely check this off to start with, because a little red line will appear and it lets you know that that is, let's just call it the active panel. And sometimes shortcuts and things change depending on which panel is active. So when you think you're in one panel and you go and hit a certain shortcut, it may have a different effect if the wrong panel has what DaVinci calls focus. So I want to see that line. Go ahead and leave that, and I'm going to update. I might have turned that off accidentally before, but I think that's on by default. Use gray background for user interface. Use gray background in viewers. This really is just preference. Turn them both on, turn them both off. Check and see what it does. See how you like the way it looks. This is the way I have it. Resize image in viewer to square pixels. This control will select between using a square or non-square pixel aspect ratio within the viewer. This is important when working with SD images which do not have a square pixel aspect ratio. Standard definition. Pretty much most of us are going to use high definition. So what it will do is if you are using an SD image that does not have square pixel ratios, it will resize it to square pixels. Delay viewer display by X number of frames. If you look in the manual, this mentions that you can enter a number of frames to delay the viewers in DaVinci Resolve so that they better sync up with external displays that are delayed due to various signal processes.
Signal processing processes. Okay, so basically if you have external displays that are getting a little lag because of all of the connections and things, then you might want to actually use this to delay your display to catch up with that. Basically, if you're not having a problem, don't worry about it. Output single field when paused. This setting will reduce flicker when grading using a computer monitor or when working with interlaced material. Ordinarily, when viewing interlaced material in stop or pause mode, field 1 is displayed followed by field 2. Depending on the image, this can result in a flicker on the display. When this option is enabled, only field 1 will be shown on the monitor when playback is paused. However, both fields will be shown when the clips are played. I haven't noticed any flickering. If I start noticing flickering, I'll come and click this box. I've always said don't fix it if it's not broke yet. So this may or may not be set to default. I would probably just leave it to whatever it is unless you start seeing a problem. Stop playback when a dropped frame is detected. I don't really want it to do that. If by some mistake of the programming or coding a frame is dropped, I don't want it to stop playing, but I do want it to stop rendering when a frame or clip cannot be processed. I don't want to render my whole final copy and something's missing. So if that's detected, I want it to stop rendering. Now project save and load. Load all timelines when opening projects. You can create multiple timelines within the same project in DaVinci, but because it's kind of RAM intensive, I really don't want them all to load unless I purposely open one of the timelines. You know, because I mean, if I save 7 different timelines within the same project because I had 7 different ideas on a direction I wanted to go with the video, that's fine. But when I open the project, I'd really just rather it open the last one that was being used. If I want to switch over to any of the others, then it can go ahead and load it, because I don't want to just take up all my memory loading timelines that I may or may not even use. So I leave this unclicked. I would suggest leaving it unclicked unless you find a reason to turn it on. Live save, go ahead and turn this on, especially at the beginning. I keep it turned on. Project backups, I don't do that yet. I haven't got to a point where I need it to do project backups, but you can do that, and then you can perform backups every so many minutes, hours, and days. And then you can set up a project backup location. Let's go to editing. Start time code. This is the industry standard time code. This is frames, seconds, minutes, and hours. Now, number of video tracks, this will be what a new project opens with. I keep it at 3 and 3 for video and audio. You can always add more and delete ones later. Audio track types, I keep them at stereo, and then if I need one to be mono, I just change it inside the software. And next we can talk about smart bins, automatic smart bins. These are choices you can make for it to automatically set up a smart bin for these things. I tend to leave them all off because I really don't use any of these specific types of smart bins. I tend to set up my own, and I'll show you what I mean. We'll hit save and come into my project here. Now in this project, there are several different types of files. There are MOV files, there are MP4 files, there are MXF files. So if I wanted a smart bin that would specifically grab my MXF files as they were imported, I'll leave it at file name, contains, and there are other options under here that you can choose. But what's here now works for me. And I'll say contains .mxf. And you'll see automatically over here, it's already grabbed my 2 MXF files that are in this project and put them together there for me. So if I said create smart bin, then you can see I click on that smart bin and it shows me my MXF files. Now I could also set up another smart bin, and I will make this all of my MOV files. And now there are all of the MOV files. Create smart bin. So here's my MXF files, here's my MOV files. Now you can do that for file types, you can do that for metadata, camera types, file size, clip length, duration, ISO. You can set it up for an unlimited amount of different parameters to collect things for you if you need to. Sometimes I tend to, when I do multicam projects, I will set up a smart bin for each one of my cameras. So I can, because I know that one camera is the one that I'm recording all my narration, another camera is the one that I'm recording something else. So I tend to want to say, okay, I need a clip from overhead, and I know that my Galaxy S6 was recording my overhead shot. So I just jump into my Galaxy S6 SmartBand, and I know that there's all my overhead shots. So let's go back to the preferences. Down here under general settings, standard generator duration, just leave this at the default. That has to do with generated effects. Standard transitions, I think this may be set to a default of 3 seconds or something. I'm not sure what it's set to, but I set it to 10 frames. I like it to take effect 5 frames before the 2 clips meet and 5 frames after the 2 clips meet. Really, just leave all of this stuff to default until you start working and find out that you want something to change. I had it all that way for a long time. I just started finding that my transitions were a little too long, and I pretty much always wanted them shorter. So you can always grab the handle of them and move them out and make them longer. So I just went ahead and changed it down to 10 frames. Default handles length, default fast nudge length. I like my fast nudge to go 3 frames instead of 5. Now, the default fast nudge length is the number of frames that are nudged when you use the shift comma or shift period keyboard shortcuts to move clips to the left and to the right. And 5 frames is usually a little much for me. I just prefer it to be 3. Pre-playhead shadow length, the number of frames in the timeline prior to the playhead covered by the playhead shadow, if enabled by choosing View, Show Playhead Shadow. I guess I'm not an expert enough to where I've gotten to where that matters yet, so I just leave it at whatever it says. I have never once used or cared about the playhead shadow, but I'm sure it might get to a point where that matters. I have a feeling it's something other than just a shadow effect on the screen. I'll have to look that up, but as for right now, I don't need it. Here is the timeline overlay retains the last performed action. Let's read this in the manual. Turn this checkbox on if you want DaVinci Resolve to always remember the last edit type you used in the timeline viewer overlay and highlight it on this overlay whenever you drag another clip over the... I'm already confused. I'm going to go ahead and stop reading there. I'm going to leave this at whatever is set. I have no need for this whatsoever. Always highlight current clip in the media pool. It's kind of one of those things where I know to accomplish that, it requires processing speed and RAM. So it's a little unnecessary. You can always right click on any clip and say find in media pool, and it'll highlight. At any given time, if you want to find it, it's just a click away. So I just leave that off. Sync the master timeline to the current frame. Let's look in the manual for this. Sync the master timeline to the current frame if you turned on automatically match master timeline with media pool in the color settings. Now I have an issue with that because if we go to the color settings, I can scroll all through this. I never see that option. Now, maybe it's because I'm not on a Mac or something, but this is another one of those little strange things where it says that in order for sync the master timeline to the current frame to work, that I had to have turned on automatically match master timeline with media pool in the color settings, which doesn't exist in the color settings. So I'm going to leave it off. Show offline reference for timeline gaps. If there's a missing clip in a conformed timeline that results in a gap in the timeline editor, turning this option on sets DaVinci Resolve to show the corresponding frames of an offline reference movie if one has been assigned to that timeline instead of black. This can be helpful in emergency situations when you're missing timeline clips right before a screening or review session. This feature lets you play or output the missing frames using the corresponding media from the offline reference movie instead of outputting black. Basically, this is saying if you have gaps between clips, when the playhead gets over that area, since there's nothing to show, it just shows black. But if you need to keep those gaps because you really don't want those clips to happen right after each other, but you haven't actually either recorded or figured out what's going to go in the gap, you can use an offline reference media clip to fill those gaps. And every time the playhead gets over the gap, you'll see that instead. something you're going to do on a professional level. Like I said, if you're trying to run out the door to get to a screening and you haven't finished your B-roll yet, just leave it off. You're never going to need that. Show offline reference for non-conformed edits. You're never going to need that. Use custom safe area overlays. When turned on, this displays an action area and title area fields that let you set a custom percentage for each. The default values are 93% for action and 90% for title. But the safe area that's programmed into DaVinci has worked correctly for me every time. I've never had to use a custom safe area. So let's go to color. This Enable HDR scopes for ST2084 is only available in the paid version. Master Reset maintains RGB balance. This is, if you'll look in the manual, it says defines how the DaVinci control panel, trackball, ring reset buttons. Well, we don't have any of that. We're not using Blackmagic trackballs and control panels. Leave it off. Wipe wraps when viewing reference stills. Turning this on lets stills wrap around the edge of the screen while you're adjusting the wipe using the mouse, rather than stopping at the screen's edge. If you find this behavior awkward when trying to quickly create full frame comparisons with stills to flip on and off, it can be disabled. High visibility power window outlines. Turning this on sets power window outlines to be drawn as green and yellow to make these windows easier to see in certain circumstances instead of the default white and gray. I'm going to actually turn that on. I've had a little bit of issue seeing my power windows. We'll get to what they are in a minute. Mattes display high contrast black and white. Leave this off unless you're having an issue seeing your alpha channels. Just keep that in mind when you get to the part about alpha channels and mattes. If you can't see it real well, open this back up and make it high contrast black and white. I just leave it. Next scene switches to visible track. Next scene is a command you can use to move to the next clip, but sometimes clips are kind of stacked on top of each other, and so your very next track may not actually be visible because it's covered up by others. Just leave this off. Another one of those, this is another option that you shouldn't change it until you find a reason to. Previous or next node navigates only to correctors. This is not in the manual, but it sounds like when you're on a node in either color or fusion page and you want to move to the next node and you use previous or next command, that it will only jump to a node if it is a corrector node. Now, just leave this the way it is. I swear sometimes they just add so much nonsense that's just absolutely unnecessary, and they wonder why their software crashes so much. I'm just going to click on whatever node that I want selected. All these ridiculous little tiny trivial options. Use legacy autocolor, leave it off. Use legacy shot match, leave it off. If you want to use legacy autocolor or shot match, Google it to see what it used to do in the older versions. There are some people that still like it. I started using DaVinci with a fairly new version, so I have no reason to want to change up what I'm already familiar with. And if you're used to this stuff, then you're probably not watching these videos anyway because you already know all of this. So just leave these off. Histogram background on tools. This pop-up menu lets you turn the histogram that appears in the background of the curves palette either off or on, based on either the node's input, which changes made to the curve do not affect the background histogram, or on, based on the node's output, changes made to the curve do affect the background histogram. You can leave it on input. When you make changes to the curve, the histogram will not change. You can choose output when you make changes to the curve and the histogram does change. Or you can just leave it on off where you won't even see the histogram. I believe the default is input and that's what I leave it as. Automatically cue 0 frames into timeline clips. This affects the next scene and previous scene commands in the color page. It's something that I have never even gotten to using. I just leave this the way it says. Switching clips, selects last adjusted node, selects first node, selects last node, selects same node. Do you really care? Color picker, DaVinci Resolve. DaVinci 2K. Leave it set the way it is. Ripple mode. This has to do if you have a DaVinci editing control panel. This is an external device. If you do not have one, skip all this. If you have one, then I'm sure you know what one of these you want to change it to. Now, printer light step calibration. The first line of this in the reference manual is for film projects. When you have tight integration with a film lab, yeah, that's not going to be practically any of us. I think most of us are just trying to make videos and get to where we can use the software. When we get to a point where we know what the words lab aim density mean, or density increment, then we'll probably come in here and change some of these things. But for right now, I think you'd probably be better off just leaving them at default. Let's go to Fairlight. Okay, the two preferences found in the general settings section both let you customize the loop jog behavior that's currently available only on the Fairlight page. Loop jog alignment. It's best to leave this centered because usually you kind of want to loop around wherever your playhead is. Loop jog width. This is 1/2 second. That's about right. If when you start doing the loop jog, and you will, we'll get to that. If you need it to be longer or shorter, you can come in here and change this. Playback settings. Hide UI overlays. This is one of those options that allows you to gain back a little performance, a little RAM, because if we look at the manual, it mentions that during playback, while you're actually playing your clips, that a lot of options like power windows, split screen views, they're disabled because you're playing back, you're watching something. So actually at that point, you don't need to have access to those options because you're playing back. Now, when playback is paused, all of these options actually come back. So if you're having performance issues, if you've got kind of an underpowered GPU, maybe you might want to turn this on and see if that makes a difference. So far, I haven't really noticed any issues, so I'll leave it off. Minimize interface updates during playback. This is another thing to click to gain back some performance. Performance mode, leave this set to automatic. If you start to get issues with your performance, come and change it to manual and then change some of these to see if it helps. So far, automatic, I haven't had issues. Control panels. The parameters in this panel let you customize the functionality of the DaVinci control panel. Some, but not all of these settings apply to third-party panels. Most of you are not going to have any panels. If you do, and these are external devices, again, that we're talking about, then you might want to come and change some of these values. I don't have any. You probably don't have any. I would leave all of these just the way they are until you come up with a reason to change them. And here we have metadata. If you would like to choose a new or create a new custom metadata field that you can categorize and organize things by, then go ahead. I usually find that there's more metadata than I know what to do with on the files that come from my cameras. So I haven't had a need to do this, but if you do, feel free to. It's very self-explanatory. And that pretty much wraps up the system and user preferences panel.
Thanks for watching that video. The next one in the series will be keyboard shortcuts and keyboard layout customization. So be sure to tune in for that one. Until then, live to learn and learn to live.